if it's what's for dinner, remember that saying? Then you might want to know where it comes from, right? Well, Bill Bullard thinks you should know. Hi, I'm Dave Price. Now, Bill started off as a cow-calf rancher in South Dakota. He also ran the South Dakota Public Utilities Commission for about a half dozen years. But for nearly a quarter century now, Bill has been the CEO of RCAF USA, the Cattle Producers National Association. He has a lot on his mind. How do you get young people thinking again about the cattle business? What about all the drought over the last several years? What that's done to the industry? Plus the Trump administration's idea to import more beef. Another main thing that's filling his days, how to bring back mandatory country of origin labeling. We're going to get into all of that in this conversation, but Bill will start us off with what he and his organization are all about. Well, first, Bill, tell us a little about your background. How'd you get to where you are?
Well, I'm a former cow-calf rancher from western South Dakota. I did a stint in state government for about 5.5 years, and now I made the full circle. I've been the CEO of this organization representing the nation's cattle producers and sheep producers since 2021.
You're the first
sorry.
CEO,
It was 2001.
Right?
It's been
2001,
some 24 years. Sorry about that.
You're short selling yourself. You were the first guy to have that position, right?
Well, actually, they had an employee before me, and then they searched for a CEO, and that's how I came to join the organization.
So day to day, what's that role entail for you?
Well, we're the largest organization that exclusively represents the producer in the multi-segmented beef supply and sheep supply chains. And so we work on issues to improve the opportunity for profitability in marketing and trade arenas. So we work on the cattle market, we work on antitrust issues, we work on, as we'll talk about later, country of origin labeling. And for the sheep industry, we're really focused on how imports have just decimated our commercial sheep industry in the United States. So we work on the issues that affect the profitability of our nation's family scale farmers and ranchers.
Do you feel like from some consumers who aren't super familiar with how this works that you've become the bad guy and you're the reason why my ribeye is more expensive?
Well, my members are the ones that are producing the ribeyes in the first place. And as we'll talk about, our market has been dysfunctional for decades. We've seen cattle producers receiving depressed prices at the same time consumers were paying inflated prices. The market is fundamentally broke, and we need to fix it. And when we do, we will benefit the consumers because then they will receive, or they will pay, a fair and competitive price in the marketplace, and producers will receive a competitive price for the cattle, not prices that are dictated by a corporate monopoly structured market like we presently have. There's serious reforms we need to make, and we're pushing hard to achieve them.
All right, so talk about how you think the market got to where it was, because this didn't happen overnight.
Certainly didn't. So let's go back to 1980, a little over 4 decades ago. Back then, we had 1.3 million cattle producers in this industry. We had 37 million mother cows. We had over 1,400 federally inspected meatpacking plants. We had 113,000 feedlots. And the 4 largest packers controlled 36% of the fed cattle market. So that was just a little over a generation ago. And back then, when a consumer went to the grocery store and bought a pound of beef, that dollar that they spent was then allocated upstream throughout the multi-segmented beef supply chain. And back then, 63 cents of every consumer dollar went to the live cattle sector, went to the farmers and ranchers that actually raised and bred and fed the animals. And only 37% or cents went to the packer and the retailer. And that made sense in a competitive marketplace because we relied upon competitive forces to properly allocate that dollar. So jump ahead to today. We've lost over 52% of our U.S. cattle farmers and ranchers. We've lost over 9 million mother cows from our herd. We've shrunk the number of feedlots in our industry to about 26,000. We've lost 77% of them. We lost about 45% of the federally inspected beef packing plants. And now the four largest packers, instead of controlling 36% of the market, they control 81% of the market. We have an unprecedented level of concentration in industry. So what has happened is with this monopoly structured marketplace, we've allowed the dominant meat packers to reduce competition in the marketplace. Through concentration, we have begun to dismantle the competitive infrastructure of the largest single segment of American agriculture, and that's the cattle industry. We generate about $1 billion in cash receipts annually, and that's much greater than any other commodity that we produce in America. And even more important, the cattle industry is the economic cornerstones of rural communities all across America, in every state of the union. And so the concentration in the marketplace, the unbridled exercise of abusive market power has forced many, many producers, hundreds of thousands of producers out of the industry. And then on top of that, we moved into this era of free trade, what we call globalization, back in the mid-1990s. And as a result of the globalization, providing the same highly concentrated meat packers access to beef from around the world that they bring into the domestic market without distinguishing it from our domestic produced beef, this has had the effect of leveraging down prices further and eliminating opportunities for our industry. And that's why we're seeing our industry is not responding to the highest nominal prices in history for cattle. They're not expanding the herd as they would have been expected to do back in 2023 when we hit record prices. So we need to look at the structure of the market. We need to change the structure of the market. We need to eliminate the forces that are brought about through concentration and globalization that has essentially is on track to destroy our U.S. cattle industry as we know it today.
All right, I want to take a brief pause for our folks who, depending on how they are consuming this conversation. For the folks who are watching video, they already know the answer to this, but truthfully, most of our people are listeners. I just want to point out that you are like a human computer right now with your statistics. You are not using notes in front of you. You have all of these numbers committed to heart. And I don't want to get off course here too much, but are you a numbers guy? How are you recounting all of these percentages and stats just like this?
So when I corrected my error and said that rather than starting here in 2021, I've been doing this since 2001. So I have been doing this for 2 decades. Yeah. And I have been focused exclusively on the factors that are adversely affecting the U.S. cattle industry. And so I know these numbers because I've researched them, I produce them, and I talk about them across the country.
You live them. All right. So how do we get more producers back in the game? How does that happen?
So we have an environment where there's been a long-term lack of profitability for the cow-calf producers, and that's our most populated segment of the industry. Those are the farmers and ranchers that maintain a mother cow herd. They produce a calf every year and then market it downstream into the industry. So as I said, we've lost 52% of those. The reason is because the environment is such that they cannot recover a profit in the marketplace, so they've exited the industry. And so what we have to do is we have to change that. We have to provide an environment and to incentivize what cattle producers we have left, and for aspiring cattle producers to enter the industry, we have to give them an opportunity to be profitable. And in order to do that, there's a couple things we need to do. Number one, we need to enforce our antitrust laws in this industry. The laws that were ignored when these 4 packers gained this unprecedented level of concentration in the first place. And then the laws like the Packers and Stockyards Act that was specifically designed to protect the independent producer individually from the excessive abusive market power of the packers. We simply have neglected and ignored these laws. These are the rules within which our marketplace is supposed to function. They've been ignored. The meat packers have taken over with their monopolistic control. And then again, we look at trade. We have to provide a relief to our domestic industry from the onslaught of imports coming in from 20 different countries that is sitting next to their products in the marketplace and not distinguished with a label. So consumers can't tell where that beef came from. And as a result of that, the packers can unilaterally decide from what country to source their beef, and consumers don't know the difference. And so we have to restore competition to the marketplace. And where you restore competition is at the grocery store shelf. It's consumers who are supposed to initiate competitive market signals that our cattle industry is supposed to respond to. But we can't, because the meat packers have intervened and have deflected the consumer demand signals, turned them into a generic signal, and they're able to satisfy them with beef from Mexico, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina, Costa Rica, or any one of the 20 countries we import from. We have to reform our import policies with tariffs and tariff rate quotas, and we have to enforce our antitrust laws and the Packers and Stockyards Act, and then we will have an environment, a marketplace that producers would have confidence in to begin the process of investing to rebuild the herd and to expand the herd. But it's not going to happen until we make these major reforms. And that's why we fully support what the president has just done, seeking an investigation into the potential price fixing, price manipulation, and illicit collusion that he says is occurring in our marketplace.
So how are you looking at kind of everything, sort of the plate full of things that the administration is doing? Obviously, you just mentioned that. Clearly, you support that type of investigation. You can't be doing cartwheels about the thought of bringing in more beef from Argentina, which has gotten a lot of the headlines, even though it's a small amount potentially.
Well, that's right. We already import about 20,000 metric tons of beef from Argentina. What they're proposing is to quadruple that. That would yet be a small percentage. However, when you add that additional beef to the excessive volume of imports already entering this country, last year, if you calculate the total volume of beef at about 4.6 billion pounds, and then you make a conversion to convert the live cattle imports into a beef equivalent, we imported 6.3 billion pounds of beef last year. So we already are suffering under the weight of these excessive, cheaper, undifferentiated imports that are eliminating opportunities for our producers, reducing their profitability, and that has to be addressed. So we have to do this one step at a time, if you will. And the first thing we need to do is what the president has begun to do, and that is to impose tariffs in order to level the playing field so our domestic producers are not competing with producers in foreign countries that don't have to meet our same standards and that benefit because of a weaker currency valuation, for example. So we need to address that through tariffs, tariff rate quotas, and then again, we go back to the reforms necessary in the marketplace itself in order to restore competition. And one of our key measures that we are proposing is mandatory country of origin labeling. We believe consumers deserve to know from what country their beef is produced in, and the only way that's going to happen is if Congress passes a law to reinstate beef into our current mandatory country of origin labeling law that presently addresses fish and shellfish and lamb and chicken and fruits and vegetables and several kinds of different nuts. We need beef to be included so consumers can begin sending demand signals to our domestic producers so that they can have the opportunity to begin expanding the herd.
Okay, let's go into the history of that, because we did have that, right? And then it wasn't necessarily the U.S. or our policymakers that killed it. It's the reaction from outside our borders. Will you give us a little history lesson on how that all fell apart?
Yes, so this was a huge battle that we joined with consumers in getting it passed in Congress in 2002. That's when country of origin labeling was first passed by Congress. However, it was not implemented for until 2009. The reason it wasn't implemented is because the domestic meat packers, that are actually global meat packers headquartered in the United States, and their allied organizations fought tooth and nail to prevent the implementation. So it wasn't implemented until 2009, and when it was only partially implemented, because at that time, the meat packers could put a label on a box of beef or a package of beef that said product of the US, Canada, and Mexico. Consumers still couldn't distinguish the beef product. And then at the meat packers' behest, Canada and Mexico filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization alleging that our country of origin labeling law was discriminating against their live cattle imports. And so that case was running parallel to the initial implementation of country of origin labeling in our domestic market. And then in 2013, USDA wrote a new rule, and that rule provided accurate labels for consumers because in May of 2013, meat products sold at retail had to be labeled as to where the animal was born, raised, and slaughtered. So consumers knew definitively where the beef they were purchasing came from. But the World Trade Organization continued to adjudicate the complaint brought by Canada and Mexico, and they issued a ruling and said, in fact, our U.S. constitutionally passed law was a violation of international trade rules because it was discriminating against Canadian and Mexican cattle. And the World Trade Organization gave Congress an ultimatum. They said, you either repeal the law or we're going to authorize Canada and Mexico to impose retaliatory tariffs on other goods that we export to those two countries. And as a result, Congress caved and they repealed country of origin labeling for beef at the end of 2015. They didn't do it in a bill, they did it in the appropriations process. It was somewhat hidden, but the effect was devastating. The effect is that no longer could domestic producers receive demand signals from consumers. And even worse than that, we fell back to an original requirement or rule where the USDA was allowing meat packers to import an exclusively foreign product, let's say a steak from Uruguay. We would import that steak from Uruguay. It would cross U.S. Customs and Border Protection in a package that said product of Uruguay. The meat could then be delivered to U.S. processing plant and taken out of the original package. They could throw the label in the garbage, put it in a new cellophane wrapper, and put a product of USA on that beef product. And so that has been happening since 2015. And there couldn't be a greater deception for consumers because consumers would look at that label and say it must be produced by American cattle ranchers when in fact it was beef that was sourced from perhaps any one of those 20 different countries. That particular rule is going to be resolved on January 1 of this year. The USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, went through a rulemaking process. And so after that, no longer, after January 1, no longer will the packers be able to deceive the consumers with a false label, a product that says USA on it, even though the beef could have come from any one of the countries we import from. So this is a huge issue. And the meat packers, their opposition to this is equal to the opposition of Canada and Mexico. And we have to overcome that in order to provide benefits to consumers.
All right, I got a few questions for you. Are there other countries that have done this country of origin label? Are we the only ones being singled out here?
So we're one of the last developing nations not to inform their consumers as to where the beef they're buying for their families was born, raised, and slaughtered. That's correct.
All right, so why? So it's just because Canada and Mexico opposed that led to this, but other countries can still do their thing?
Certainly. This complaint was specific to the United States country of origin labeling rule. But again, the multinational meat packers and their allied organizations have fought tooth and nail to prevent the reinstatement of country of origin labeling for beef. So it isn't just Canada and Mexico. It's the global meat packers who it's not in their economic interest to allow consumers to distinguish the beef because right now they can unilaterally choose and they can maximize their profits by buying from the cheapest possible source and selling it to unsuspecting consumers at the same price as domestic product. And so right now, where consumers are paying the highest nominal prices in history for beef, if we had country of origin labeling, I think we would see a difference in pricing. I think imported product would be priced cheaper than domestic product, and then consumers could choose if they would rather purchase beef produced under a foreign food safety regime at a lesser cost, or if they would rather support our domestic supply chain so that we can achieve our national security interests of being self-reliant in the production of such an important staple as beef, one of our most important protein sources.
All right, so for those of us who didn't grow up on a ranch, I still got one thing that I don't get here. You've already given us a list of things, of other products that still have the country of origin labeling.
right?
Why is beef different?
Well, beef is different because it's the largest segment of American agriculture. It's hugely profitable for the multinational meat packers to source cheaper beef from around the world. Again, we were at 6.3 billion pounds of it
Mm-hmm.
last year. And they make a huge margin on that imported product because they don't have to distinguish it. I'm sorry, I may have missed the last part of your
No,
question.
not at all. No, that I think that it just points out how I mean, we got different things going on in different directions here. So, are you feel is there the juice, the energy, the focus to address this in Congress, do you think? Or are the meatpacking powers greater than your producers' powers here when it comes to getting Congress's attention?
Well, the opportunity we have today is unlike any we've had in the past, and that's because we have never seen such an intense focus on the U.S. cattle industry and the beef supply chain as we see today. And so right now, all of government, the administration and Congress are seeking solutions to begin rebuilding the herd, again, to meet our national security needs, being self-reliant in beef production. You see, over that same 40 years that we talked about earlier, back in 1980, about 10% of the beef consumed in America was imported. Now that figure is upwards of 22%. So we've more than doubled our dependence on foreign countries for our beef. And so it's vitally important that we make the reforms. We now have a focus like we've never seen on our industry. This is the time to begin proposing solutions like mandatory country of origin labeling, and like the imposition of tariffs and tariff rate quotas and the enforcement of antitrust laws. And I don't recall a time when we had the President of the United States actually call for an investigation and allege that the meat packers are engaged in unlawful activity, as we have just seen very recently.
So, how do you make sure that this stays at the forefront? That this is not, and I'm not picking on the president or any other politician, but it's one thing to say, I'm going to look into this. It's a whole other thing to have some kind of accountability and action. How do you make sure that it stays a priority?
Well, so we've been trying to get the government to initiate an investigation since 2008. We've made several requests to different federal agencies urging them to investigate the market because of our belief that it was dysfunctional. And investigations occurred, but no enforcement action was taken. We finally recognized in early 2019 that government was disinterested in reforming our beef supply chain. And so we took the bull by the horns, if you will, and our membership filed a class action antitrust lawsuit against the four largest beef packers in the United States, alleging that they have unlawfully colluded in order to depress cattle prices paid to producers. So we started an antitrust enforcement action back in 2019 that's currently working its way through the court system. And back then, that was before we had the anomaly occurrence of the fire at a Tyson meatpacking plant in Holcomb, Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, the market was erratic. We saw cattle prices fall, we saw beef prices rise. The U.S. Department of Agriculture initiated an investigation back then. And then the COVID pandemic struck in 2020. And at that point, President Trump, in his first term, called for an investigation. So there has been an investigation by the Department of Justice that has been running parallel with our private antitrust action. And so the president's call today, I believe, is very meaningful and genuine because, as we allege in our lawsuit, the meat packers did engage in antitrust violations. And so the government can now look at our case and look at the documents within our case and find the same evidence that we're using as we prosecute this case against the Packers. So the other way to keep this at the forefront of the government's attention is for us to do what we do as an organization, and that is we continually contact the administration and Congress, urging the introduction of different bills. For example, we were instrumental in getting the country of origin labeling bill introduced. And now we're pushing hard for more tariffs on those countries that persistently maintain a trade surplus with the United States. In other words, there's no reciprocity. We're importing beef from Australia and New Zealand and Brazil and they're not taking any of our beef, so it's leaving us with a huge trade deficit. Even Canada and Mexico, we import 3 times the volume of beef from Canada and Mexico than we export to them. And we can't continue to buy more than we sell. Otherwise, we keep racking up this trade deficit, and the trade deficit has a negative impact on the profitability, the reduction of demand for domestic beef, and it hurts our industry. So we need to constantly push on these issues in order to keep these issues at the forefront for an administration and a Congress who is now already focused on the issue.
I'm not questioning your passion in any way, and I'm going to really get out of my knowledge lane here, but in so many different industries, we see fewer and fewer competitors and the big guys getting bigger. So what fuels your confidence, your optimism that the legal route you are pursuing can do something, can accomplish something? You've been, like you said, you've been fighting this since 2019. We're talking in 2025, so you must be a patient man.
So I'm sorry, ask me that question again.
Well, how do you, I just feel like in so many industries right, we have these big corporate giants are huge, fewer and fewer competitors, and they buy up they're buying, this one's buying this one's buying this. And so that's what you're left with. And this feels similar to the meatpacking industry.
Exactly. And that's precisely why we have not enforced our antitrust laws for decades. We took the position that while our antitrust laws were intended to protect and preserve competition, there was a new school of thought out there and said, no, what we should really be pursuing is efficiency. If we can gain efficiencies through largeness of scale, that would theoretically benefit consumers because they'd have more choices and lower prices. So now we know that's an abject failure. That hasn't occurred. Consumers have been paying record prices, and we've been seeing record numbers of producers exit the industry because of lack of profitability. So we now have a renewed focus on antitrust, a renewed focus on restoring competition as the standard by which we determine whether a merger should occur or whether a meat packer is engaged in a practice for procuring cattle that is detrimental to the interests of individuals and actually harming them financially. And so the nation is shifting in terms of how it looks at these various industry sectors. And as you said, it's not just the cattle and sheep industries that have been decimated because of this adherence to the theory that bigger is better and centralization is better. And that's what we found absolutely wrong during the COVID pandemic. We had developed a highly concentrated, centralized industry that could not withstand an economic shock like a widespread disease. And that means we can't withstand an economic shock if there's an animal disease outbreak or if there's a climatic issue that we face. So our industry is not resilient. It's incapable of persistently producing an abundant, affordable supply of beef for consumers. And that now that we're working to change that right now. And we think that because of this, because of the shift in the winds, if you will, the pendulum is swinging back, that there's a renewed focus now on how important competition is to our free enterprise system.
A sidebar question for you as we come to a close. I'm curious, some of us learned a little bit about the life of a cattle rancher in a Hollywood style with the whole Yellowstone series, right? And for the sake of all of us, we need to make sure that all of our ranches are not run the way John Dutton ran his, with all the secrets and all the stuff that happened there. But you do travel all over the place, and so you really truly know these cattle producers, these ranchers from all over our country. What is it about them? Kind of talk a little bit about the passion that drives these folks. They've had to endure all this foreign competition you're talking about, all the antitrust concerns that you've talked about. We've had crazy droughts, unfortunately, in parts of our country that have really decimated the huge fires that Texas and Oklahoma had to deal with. But can you talk about the passion of these folks and what What kind of pushes them forward? Why do they do this?
So these are people who I consider the salt of the earth. They are small business entrepreneurs. Many of them are fourth, fifth, and sixth generation ranchers. They care for the land, they care for their water, they care for the air. They epitomize the best environmental stewards that we have in America. And they have both an economic and an emotional reason to do so. And as you indicated, they deal with the vagaries of weather all the time. They deal with volatile markets. Unless we can provide them a genuine opportunity to remain profitable, we will continue to see a mass exodus of producers. I talked about the cattle industry losing over half the producers that were in business just a generation ago. The sheep industry is even worse. We've lost over 60% of all of our sheep producers, 60% of our commercial sheep herd. And last year, when I said that 22% of the beef in the U.S. is imported, that consumers are consuming, in the lamb industry, it's just terrible. 73% of all the lamb consumed in America last year was imported from primarily Australia and New Zealand. And so we've seen domestic consumption increasing while domestic production was decreasing. And that's a classic example of market failure in an industry. And so these people are, they're hardy, they're fighters, they care deeply for their land and their livestock, and they're out, in inclement weather and again, facing, some would view insurmountable odds, but many of these people just have that driving passion that places them in this position, and that's where they want to stay.
Thank you, Bill. Really appreciate the conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
For more about Bill and RCAF, you can check out our profile piece. It's in the American Farmland Owner Weekly Newsletter. It's the place where landowners get their news for thoughtful conversations, industry challenges, and trends. You can see it right now at AmericanFarmlandowner.com. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast. We really appreciate it if you let others know what we are building here. Thanks for doing that. And thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.